for authors, filmmakers, entertainment, and all your listening needs. Listen now to Talk Now Radio, where no topic is taboo.
Hello everyone, welcome to Talk Now Radio. This is your host, Royce the Redneck Radio Man. And joining me today is going to be Scotty Roberts. Now, originally the plan was to have him and John Ward, his co-author in the book The Exodus Reality, join me today. However, John's schedule has gotten kind of overbooked and he was unable to make it with everything that was going on today. So Scotty and me is going to do the whole thing without him this time anyway. And look forward to having him at a future date on perhaps another book or something. Now, if you want to learn more about this book, The Exodus Reality, you can always go to www.exodusreality.com. And you can also probably pick up a little bit more information on Scotty's website, Intrepid at www.intrepidmagazine.com. Is that correct, Scotty?
It's intrepidmag.com.
Mag, okay.
It's the shortened version.
Alrighty, thanks. I'm glad I got you to correct that when I was sure enough getting it wrong. Okay, but today, folks, we're going to talk about the Exodus Reality, and they got some interesting views. These two did not exactly see eye to eye on everything, but yet they managed to put it together in one book and make it very interesting. Before we get started, anybody who wants to ask questions, you can always call in at area code 832-632-7904. And you can also ask questions in the chat room here at www.talknowradio.net. And I'd like to remind everybody, I was having trouble with my email server, so it went back to some hackers that got a hold of the domain talknowradio.com and were spoofing it. So I'm running talknowradio.net instead, so I could try to get my email server back up as soon as possible. And I'm just going to do away with the old .com and let the internet hackers have it. In other words, they want it so bad. So, Scott, how are you doing today?
Well, Royce, I'm doing great. Sorry, I had my mute button on there, and I was looking for a headset. Not in my studio. I'm at my laptop, and I'm sitting outside where here in western Wisconsin, just not far from the Minneapolis area in Minnesota, it has gone from a blizzard and 10 inches of snow last Friday to 70 degrees today, and there's no snow left, and it's just been gorgeous. So I have moved my my office from my permanent office digs out to the garage where I can sit and be one with nature.
Wow, that is like a night and day change in weather, isn't it?
Ain't that the truth? Well, that's spring in the Minnesota-Wisconsin area for you.
Sounds like spring in the Houston area. But we are both in the Central Time Zone, too, and that may have a lot to do with it.
Yes.
So, at any rate, coming down to this book now, you're going to have to help refresh my memory a little bit on it, Scott, because as you know, I read it 5-6 months ago, before you guys ended up going to Egypt for y'all's tour up there that we tried to schedule a show before and we missed. So I've read some other books since then and had a chance to have this kind of get a little bit back in the back corners of my mind, if you know what I mean.
I do.
So I do realize that you thought Akhenaten was really one person and John thought he was another. But before we go into that, I have a question I think any reasonable person would ask. Why wouldn't Moses just simply be the Moses as the Bible describes?
Well, I think he is, and the problem you have is not one of faith. You can accept the biblical story just by faith, whether you are Jewish, raised in synagogue, or Christian, whatever you might be, and you accept the Moses story as being a faith story. You don't need any facts to back that up because you accept that by faith. What John and I are doing in this book is saying, who was Moses? Why don't we, if he was such an important character in history, and such an important figure in three major religions recognize him, then why in the world is he so hard to find in history? And so that's the question John and I really wanted to look into, was one of not trying to resolve anybody's faith question about Moses, because if you believe it by faith, it's already resolved for you. What we wanted to find out is it's interesting to look into this and find out, is there evidence for the historical man? And where you had mentioned in your intro, where John and I are a bit head to head on this, it's not so much that as we both respect each other's theories, even though we have differing theories on Moses. And they're only really separated by about 80 to 90 years on the Egyptian timeline. Same royal family, just 2 generations apart. And I tend to take a more biblically, how would you say it? My view is more, it's not a biblical viewpoint. I'm not coming in from a faith standpoint, but I do lend credence to the historicity of the Bible. And so I'm saying the Bible is just as pertinent a document in history as anything else that we use from ancient history. And that the history contained therein is efficacious. And so I base mine more on a biblical point of view and a biblical timeline. And John is a little less, he's a little more of a biblical minimalist, and thinks Moses was more of an archetype that was picked up and became, in a sense, like legend within Israelite history. And so we have our differing points of view there, but where there are certain things we also come together on very strongly. And so that's our starting point with this book was not one to establish the Moses of faith, because you don't really need to. If you believe it, you believe it. The question was, can we find him in history? And so that's what we wanted to do with this book.
It's a very interesting thing for me that you brought up, because I was listening to what you said about how famous he was. And, you would think there'd be a historical record, because it dawned on me that the 3 most famous, well-known people in the entire Bible, and these ain't the 3 only well-known ones, as you and me both know, but I would say better known than any of them. To my knowledge, there is no historical record for that we've been able to find of yet, and that would be Abraham, Moses, and Jesus.
Right.
Would yours pretty much line up with that theory?
I would say so, and you could probably throw Noah into the mix there as well.
Yeah.
These are characters, and of course they get written off very easily by people not of faith as being legendary characters or mythological characters. And so part of the reason for looking for the historical Moses or any of these characters that you mentioned is to establish that, yes, while I might have faith in them, is my faith well placed? And that's the question I had, because I've had struggles of faith over the years. Raised Christian, I was in theological seminary, I was in ministry, and I drifted away from that a bit because I had my questions about things, and things in my 20s and my 30s. I had a real hard time reconciling certain things with certain things. And it made me drift away from faith a bit. And so I said, is there a way to verify historically or to back up something? Faith to me should not always just be blind. Faith, while you believe something, faith needs to have an object. And for me, the more solidity I can put to something, the more it strengthens my faith. And so for me, I've studied Moses for a long time. And he was a favorite character of mine during my seminary days. I wrote papers on Moses. Actually, the first time I really delved into this was not from an aspect of being outside the faith, but from one that was thoroughly within the faith. And I wrote a huge paper in seminary on the educational system of 18th dynasty Egypt that Moses would have encountered, having grown up there for the first 40 years of his life. And that was really my foray into this. And I have to go even further back than that. When I was a kid in 9th grade, in junior high school, I did a comic book version. I was always an illustrator, and I was an illustrator for a good portion of my career, a designer and an illustrator over the last 30 years. But when I was a kid, I did a comic book version of Moses, it actually won me a scholarship to a Christian high school. And because there were some people within that the hierarchy at that church and school that saw it and said, this kid ought to come to our school. And so I was given a scholarship. And but Moses has been with me. I say he's been like on hound's feet following me most of my life. And I figured there was a reason for this.
Sort of like an unseen mentor.
Yes. And so, and it really has culminated now in this book. And I have to say, while I have fairly established theories that I put forward in this book that I've been working on for years, as John and I will agree, our theories are as good as the next new discovery. If somebody were to come along, as long as we're putting shovels in the ground and trowels in the sand, there's going to be a new discovery along the way. And it's either going to add an apple to the apple cart, or it's going to totally upturn the apple cart. So neither John and I, while we are very invested in our theories, and we have friendly, tat for tats about it, and we go back and forth and in a very friendly way, but neither of us are so invested to say we know the solid answer on this. We both
are not married to it.
Right. We both think we are on the right track in our own viewpoint, but we're open to learn and say, there could be something new that totally throws it on its ear. And because we don't know everything there is to know about it.
You kind of like have to take that perspective, given the fact there's so much that hadn't been found yet, don't you?
Absolutely. I mean, there is, and we state this in the book, is that while there is no direct historical or archaeological evidence that places Moses in Egypt, or the Exodus as a real event, other than the Bible itself, you can sometimes go to secondhand archaeological or historical evidence to establish plausibility. One of the big questions that we answer in the book, in our point of views, was there's no evidence for Hebrew slaves in Egypt. There's just no evidence for it. How many cultures, especially the Egyptian culture, recorded the events and the lives and the deeds of their slave culture, their slave class? Not many. And so there's no real evidence. So there has been a lot of scholarship done on it that simply throws out the notion that there were Hebrew slaves in Egypt. However, you can establish that by some of the biblical passages, and you compare them to things going on in real history, in Egyptian history, you can start to establish a plausible thread. For instance, the Egyptians in ancient documents referred to peoples that they referred to as the Asiatics, who would move in from the Canaanite and the Syrian and the Mesopotamian regions and move into the Nile Delta area during times of famine or drought, or just a better grazing land for their flocks, into the very fertile Nile Delta region and up in the north of Egypt. And they would speak of them with some disdain, these shepherding peoples who would
the Hyksos.
And what's that?
The Hyksos.
Right. And what's very interesting here, and I might as well get into this right now, is that in the book I wanted to establish the biblical story. What's the biblical story of the Hebrews or the Israelites, the children of the family of Jacob, coming to Egypt in the first place? Why were they even there, according to the biblical passage? It said that there was famine in the Canaanite region. They came down, brought their whole family down, and relocated the 70 members of their family into Egypt. And they were given the best land. But the story revolves around what is considered to be a legendary character, Joseph. The same Joseph of, Joseph in the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. Joseph in the coat of many colors, that story. It's a Hebrew story, and some think a Hebrew legend, some think even a myth, that it didn't really happen. And so I went through a bit of that story to give us a little background to the Hebrew or the Israelite family having relocated to Egypt. And one of the first issues of establishing plausibility is that for nearly 800 years, tribal families, nomadic cultures, tribes from the Canaanite region resettled in the Delta region of Egypt. It was a known historical fact that peoples from those regions came all the time. And so now pinpointing down to Joseph is the big question. And if you remember, if you read in the Genesis and the Exodus passages in the Bible, they never really name the pharaohs in these events. They talk about Joseph and his life and the pharaoh, and this pharaoh did this, that pharaoh did that, but they don't name the pharaohs, and so they don't give you historical context. However, there are hints at the context historically. And one of those was this. Now, if you remember the story of Joseph, he was sold into slavery by his older brothers, all the sons of Jacob. They were jealous of him because their father favored him. He was the younger son, made him the coat of many colors, and elevated him. And Joseph didn't help the matter any by always bragging to his brothers that God gave him dreams showing his 12 older brothers, or 11 older brothers bowing to him. And he didn't help matters with that. And they got jealous one day, and they sold him off into slavery. And it ends up for many years, Joseph is a slave in Egypt. He's imprisoned in Egypt. The whole story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife, where he's elevated to the position of the high steward of Potiphar, the man who was really in charge of the whole prison system in Egypt at the time, and at least according to the Genesis story. And he's elevated to high position in his house, and the guy's young wife keeps hitting on Joseph. And Joseph finally runs and leaves his cloak in her hand, and she cries rape because she's the spurned woman. And he ends up in prison. And actually in the story it says that Potiphar really didn't believe his wife, but he couldn't take the word of a slave over his wife. And so Joseph gets imprisoned. He interprets dreams. That comes to the attention of the Pharaoh. He interprets the Pharaoh's dreams. The Pharaoh elevates him to the highest position in the land. Here is and I asked the question in the book, why would a Pharaoh of Egypt raise an Asiatic or a Canaanite slave to the elevated position, lofty position of Grand Vizier of Egypt, one step off of the throne? All the power that existed in Egypt it was in his hand, except the claim for the throne itself. And frankly, the Grand Vizier of Egypt was actually Pharaoh in the absence of Pharaoh. So he elevated him to damn near a royal status and granted him all of this. So the question is, why would he do this?
And the best land in Goshen.
Yes, and there's the big second question.
And his own chariot and the whole 9 yards.
And his brothers show up, as he's 20 years now he's been gone, or so. And his brothers show up because there's famine in Canaan, according to the biblical story. And they go begging of the Grand Vizier to have land where they can graze their flocks up in the Delta region. And at this time, remember, the capital of Egypt was in Memphis, which is just today, modern day Memphis is just about 30 miles south of Cairo, right at the mouth of the Nile Delta. But what are they doing up there, ruling up in Memphis, when the royal seat was down in Luxor, Thebes, which was almost 500 miles to the south? And so it's very plausible when you look at who would have been on the throne in this time. It was, I believe, and you mentioned it, the Hyksos people. These were and not really.
I read that at. I read it in your book.
Yeah, well, there you go. Well, the Hyksos people weren't this invading horde that came in and took over. They took over from within, really, and they invaded from within. The Hyksos peoples were by blood Canaanite peoples, Syrian peoples. They were the people from the Middle East, these Asiatics, who for 700 to 800 years had been migrating into the Delta region and then eventually settling in the towns and the cities. And I'm sure over the generations became involved in the civic. They was their cities. They were there. They lived there. And they ended up taking over the Egyptian throne, only they divided the kingdom and they set up their own monarchy, their own pharaonic line out of Memphis, which is in the north. And then Luxor, or ancient Thebes as it was known, was in the south, and it divided the kingdom. And so these were the days of the divided kingdom of Egypt, the upper and the lower Egypt. And remember, the Nile runs north and empties into the Mediterranean. So Upper Egypt is in the south and Lower Egypt is in the north. So they ruled Lower Egypt. And the Hyksos people, or the Hyksos hold on the northern throne, lasted about 110 years up in the north. And it was finally a pharaoh named Ahmose who drove them out. And after about 110 years. Now, here's the situation. And here's something that I think it's not, this is what I mean by secondhand evidence. It's not hard, fast evidence, but it establishes plausibility. I asked the question, why would a pharaoh raise Joseph to the throne? And secondly, why would he give the best land in all of the delta to the children of Jacob to settle? Now, here's an interesting passage. Now, keep in mind, I said in the book of Genesis that it doesn't mention the pharaoh's names, but it says that Joseph's brothers, after the whole dramatic story, how much of that is verbatim and true, I don't know, but if Joseph is indeed this grand vizier now of Egypt, his brothers come to him, he reveals who he is, they sold him into slavery 20 years earlier, and now he's the grand vizier, and the great verse in the Bible, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good, because here I am, ready to save my family during this time of drought. And so they come to him, and he says, now, Joseph tells his brothers in the biblical passage in Genesis, he says, when you go into Pharaoh, he says, I'm going to ask him to give you this land, the best land in all of Egypt, in Goshen, which is really just out a little bit to the east of what is present-day Cairo. And he said, I'm going to have him give this land to you. He says, but when you go into Pharaoh, he says, tell him that you are currently shepherds, and you've been shepherds since the days of your youth, because the Egyptians hate shepherds. And I thought, and it gives no explanation for that. I thought, what a weird thing to tell his brothers to do. Tell the Pharaoh of all the land who's going to grant you this finest land in all of Egypt that you're shepherds, because Egyptians hate shepherds. I thought that makes no sense. Until you look at the earlier definitions of the Egyptian word for Hyksos was the shepherding people. And when you consider the fact that very probably that the king that Joseph is dealing with here, the Pharaoh in the north that he is dealing with, is one of the Hyksos people, because he sees them as brothers, and they are all of this shepherding stock. They are all of the same bloodlines from the Canaanite region. And so when he says, tell them you're shepherds, because the Egyptians, the guys in the south, hate shepherds, they're appealing to a Hyksos king who also hates Egyptians, because they've set up their own monarchy under the Hyksos rule. And so this is one of the first very slim clues you get, but a clue establishing plausibility, that these Asiatics were constantly moving into the delta, that very possibly Joseph was set up as Grand Vizier, and he raised to that status because it's almost like the Pharaoh would be saying, we are blood brothers, we are kin, we're from the same region, we're of the same bloodlines. And so, and then you see in the Joseph story, he moves his whole family there, and it says, and Joseph and all his brothers die, and a generation passes, and a new Pharaoh comes to the throne, it says in the biblical text.
That knows not Joseph.
That knew not Joseph, or in the vernacular, in the Hebrew, had no regard for Joseph, or didn't give a rat's ass about Joseph.
Or an Egyptian, not a Hyksos.
Right, he's an Egyptian king. The Pharaoh raises up, and what does he do? He slaps the Hebrews, as the Bible calls them, into bondage. And what does he say? And we always miss this. We always think, well, if there weren't Hebrews, so why would he have done that? Well, it says that what this Pharaoh did, he said, let us put them into hard labor, lest they rejoin our enemies and again take our country from us. That's always missed when people seem to be talking about this. It's just a little phrase in there. Lest they rejoin our enemies and retake our country from us. This, I think, could be none other than Ahmose the first, or Tutmosis the first, or Amenhotep the first. It is, Ahmose or Tutmosis, because this is the king who said, look, it was the father of Tutmosis. my father drove the Hyksos out of northern Egypt. We have reclaimed it. Now I am raised to the throne. Let us slap the remnants of these Hyksos peoples into hard labor, lest they rejoin our enemies and fight against us from within again. So the option was to kill them all or to use them as slave labor, and that's exactly what they did. And it established a lineage of Israelite people, along with, I'm sure, other Canaanite peoples and Syrian peoples and, Sinatic peoples, people who came over from what was considered to be the Asians. And they came over and they slapped these people, these remnants of the Hyksos, all into bondage so they would not reform military and retake what they had just won back. And this is why I think they actually became enslaved peoples. And this would have been, and we know when Amos reigned in Egypt, he was the man who drove out the Hyksos. We know the dates of these things. And Amos's son was Thutmose I, and his daughter was Hatshepsut. And this is where I start to, Hatshepsut was the woman who became the female pharaoh of Egypt and reigned for 20 plus years. Now, I believe she is the woman who found Moses in the Nile. And so this is where I start setting the stage for my theory on who I believe Moses was, on the basic timeline, to say the Hebrews or the Israelites, the family of Israel, who had migrated and for a couple of hundred years had grown exponentially there. It says they dwelt in the land of Egypt for some 350 to 400 years before the Exodus. If they came in during Joseph, during the Hyksos period, when a non-Hyksos king came in and wiped the Hyksos out, reclaimed the northern throne, reunited the kingdom, he slapped the remnants of these people into bondage, which was a common custom. That, to me, establishes plausibility for the biblical account. It does not prove it existed or happened. It says it establishes that the story is plausible historically within the pages of the Bible.
Right. Establishes that it could have went down that way, not that it did.
Right. Exactly. We don't know for sure. You know, if you're a person of faith, you know for sure it happened that way. If you step outside the box of faith and look back in, you can say, I don't see a reason that it couldn't have happened, but what is the proof that it happened? And while you can't really prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt, you can establish plausibility, which is really, I think, a very strong rudimentary evidence for the existence of the story.
Well, there is an old saying, where there's smoke, there's fire.
Right.
The same principle applies, I think, to this here. Even a judge, and in most cases, once you get a certain amount of circumstantial evidence, lean toward the fact that it actually happened.
Exactly. And it just goes out from there. My theory on Moses extends from there. John places his theory another 80 years further down the line. And I'll just cut to the quick, and if we have time, we'll talk about it. But my candidate for Moses, because I think he fits the plausible picture, is a man named Senenmut, who was a grand vizier, just like Joseph was, a grand vizier, underneath the female pharaoh, Hatshepsut. And I believe Hatshepsut was the woman who is also known as Matakare. She was the woman who, at a very young age, like around 10 years old, would have been the woman who found Moses in the basket in the Nile. And remember, the Bible refers to her not by name, but it refers to her as Pharaoh's daughter. I believe that was an homage that Moses, when he penned the book of Exodus, paid to her, because the Hatshepsut bore a royal title, and that royal title was Pharaoh's daughter. It meant the only royal female heir of the Pharaoh. And so at the time that she was 10, she was known by title, like we would say, think of the English monarchy, we would talk of Your Majesty or Your Highness. She was known as Pharaoh's daughter. That was her title. And if this is the woman who found him in the Nile, she bore the title, and it's repeated in the book of Exodus, Pharaoh's daughter. Not just a phrase or just a noun. It was her title. And if she found Moses in the Nile, and there's a lot of questions about the whole Nile, well, that's just like the story of Osiris, so it's obviously a myth. I say, why don't you look at that from the other way around? What if the Hebrews, or the Israelites, having been in Egypt for 300 plus years now, what if they were a little less, we would like to attribute Judaism to them. They were not Jews because Judaism didn't exist yet. Moses founded Judaism after the Exodus. These were all a Hebraic people or an Israelite culture that were an enslaved caste. I believe they were more Egyptianized than anything else. There may have been some believers in the Jehovah God, but there was not Jehovah worship like you have it in Judaism prior to the Exodus. And these were people who grew up. Why do you think these people complained? Why do you think they later built a golden calf who was, it was a representation of the Egyptian goddess Hathor? Why did they do that? Because they were an Egyptianized people. Hebrew by blood, Egyptian by life. That's like me, I'm Scottish and Welsh. But my family's been in the Americas for 350 years. I'm American, but I'm Welsh by blood, but I'm American by birth. By who I am. And so I think the same thing with the Hebrews. And I believe Moses' mother, when she put Moses in the basket, I don't think that that's just a legendary retelling of the birth of Moses to look like Osiris. I think that that is Moses' mother, knowing full well the Egyptian tales of Osiris. And she was the one playing into the existing mythology of the Egyptian religion and the Egyptian character of Osiris. And I believe she put him in a basket to mimic the Osiris, and that she knew who her audience was going to be. It said that it doesn't say she put him on the Nile and just floated him haphazardly down the river. It said she placed him in a basket amongst the reeds on the bank of the Nile, at the place where Pharaoh's daughter came to bathe. She knew exactly what she was doing. I think it was well planned out by her. She put this baby in the basket to mimic the Osiris story, placed it in the place where the daughter of the Pharaoh would find him. And because it says her entourage found the baby in the basket where she was bathing. And she took him in. Then it says she returned Moses to his mother to be weaned until she was old enough to claim him, which also reestablishes that Hatshepsut was being about 10 years old at this time. I think she was too young to claim a baby. She sent him back to his mother until she could claim him. Then she claimed him. Excuse me. And all of this is based on my hinge pin date, which you find in the Bible. This is where I say I'm overtly biblical in the dating. There is a hinge pin date in the Old Testament that is a solid historical date, even though there's controversy about the topic. The topic is the establishment of Solomon's temple in Jerusalem about 1,000 years later. Now, Solomon's temple was built, not 1,000, about 500 years later. Solomon's temple was built in Jerusalem right around 966 BC is the median date. Now there's controversy whether Solomon or David, his father, ever really existed. But for those who know that Temple 1 existed, as it's called in archaeological terms, Temple 1 was built in the mid-10th century BC. And the median date ends up 966. Now, in the Bible, in the book of 1 Kings, chapter 6, verse 1, there's a verse that says, and when on the day that Solomon dedicated Temple 1 in Jerusalem, it was the 480th year since the Exodus. Now, if we know that Temple 1 was founded in the mid-10th century, if you add the rounded figure of 480 years, you get roughly 1446 is the date of the Exodus, 1445 to 1446. Now, if Moses, according to the biblical story, was indeed 80 years old, if you add 80 years onto 1446, you get 1526 as the approximate birth year of Moses. This would have been year 1 of the Pharaoh, Tutmosis I, who was the son of Amos, who drove the Hyksos out of Egypt. And you have his daughter, Hatshepsut, would have been about 7 to 10 years old in 1526. And if she is indeed the woman who found Moses in the Nile, the circumstantial evidence establishes it's a plausible story. And then it just goes off from there. There's so much more that links this Senenmut character to Moses by the years, the dates of his life. I can jump ahead and just say Senenmut he gained 92 royal titles granted to him by Hatshepsut throughout his life. Amongst his royal titles he was elevated to the Grand Vizier of Egypt. She gave him the title of the hereditary crown prince of Egypt. She made him the Grand Royal Architect. And 92 titles altogether. And she also gave him his name. I believe when she named Moses, by the biblical story, in Egyptian history, I believe she also gave him his name. All we know about Senenmut in Egyptian history was that he was born to commoners. That's all we know about him. And that he had a brother and a sister, a couple of brothers and a couple of sisters, or something like that. We were given names of the commoners who were his parents, but we know nothing of commoners. Could that mean a character in Egyptian history who rose to royal status? Would they say he was the son of slaves? Would they say he was the son of common laborers, commoners? What would it be? We don't know for sure, but we do know that Hatshepsut also gave him his name, Senenmut, and that name means mother's brother. In other words, I, your mother, am elevating you to the status of brother to the gods with me. That's the name Senenmut. And there's also a lot of speculation that he and Hatshepsut, who was maybe 7 to 10 years older than he was, ended up being lovers. And there's very strong evidence for that, even though it's circumstantial. But Senenmut disappears completely. One of the most influential, important men in ancient 18th dynasty, who was a non-royal, leaves behind 2 unfinished tombs, which you can still visit today. No record of his death or his disappearance or burial. Never found a mummy. Tombs never used. And he disappears completely off the scene right around the year that Moses would have turned 40 by the biblical calendar, 1486. Senenmut would have been roughly around the same age. He completely disappears from Egyptian history. And this, I speculate, and there's more facts that I use to speculate this, but this is the superficial stuff. I think it's because he fled Egypt. And he totally disappeared. And I think that there was factionalism going on. And I think you have to start looking into Hatshepsut and her stepson, who was the rightful pharaoh, and she really usurped the throne from him as his co-regent because she was the daughter of the pharaoh, but this was her stepson by her brother husband, which is what they did back then. He was the rightful pharaoh when his father died, but was only 3 years old, so Hatshepsut became co-regent, then eventually a few years later took over as pharaoh and reigned for 21 years. He grew up, and while there was peace in the kingdom, he even became the general of her armies. Here's the guy who really has the rightful claim to the throne by the line of succession. He did not do anything to overtly try to claim the throne from his stepmother. He reigned as even the general of the armies, and it was still peaceful. But I believe there was factionalizing, and it's very evident in some of the history. And if you look at the reign of Elizabeth I of England, you get a pretty good picture for what I think the court of Hatshepsut must have been like.
Right.
And so you start to put all these things together, and you end up with a pretty solid picture for Senenmut. And there's even more detail to that, and I don't know how much time we have left or how much we can get into, but I also want to try to present John's theory as well, so you get an idea of what he puts forward as well.
Okay, but how about real quick, I wanted to ask you a question here. Actually, I had 2 of them typed out while you were talking. One of them was, what do you think finding out Moses was really Senenmut might do to somebody's faith who learned of the Bible and the story of Moses as being just that, Moses, and would never expect him to had an Egyptian history, in other words?
I don't think it should do anything. It shouldn't hurt anybody's faith, because as we all know, there's a whole lot more to an 80-year story than the hour it might take you to read in the Bible. There's a whole lot of facts. When you're not even given the names of the pharaohs, you know that you're missing facts.
That's true.
And so if you believe that Moses was a real guy and really interacted with these monarchs, yet you don't even have the names of the monarchs, you don't have a date, you don't know exactly when they have, you just believe by faith that it's true, you've got to know by default that you're missing information. And so Moses was somebody in Egypt. I know in evangelical Christianity, which is what I was raised in and schooled in, you don't have the stories that you get from Jewish tradition, from the mikveh, the mishvah, the mishnah, the Jewish traditional tales of Moses. There are stories of Moses that go far beyond what you find in the Old Testament or the New Testament, and they are as old as the Torah itself. These traditional tales, some of them tell of Moses being this great general in Egypt who quelled rebellions for the Pharaoh. Which is consistent with, and not inconsistent at all with, the kind of man Senenmut would have been. Even though there's no record of him quelling rebellions, his first duty in the household of Hatshepsut was as the royal steward and the tutor to the royal daughter, Neferuri, the princess. Now, tutors back then were not school marms, wet behind the ears and just book educated. They were generally nobles of high ability or military commanders of high rank that have been brought into the Pharaoh's household to do the tutoring. And so I think that fits the picture there. There are stories that Moses, when he left Egypt after killing the Egyptian taskmaster and flees Egypt for fear of the Pharaoh's wrath, the Bible story just tells us he went to Midian, out somewhere in the Sinai, and he married the daughter of the high priest Jethro there. And he's married her until his burning bush experience. 40 years, suddenly it's 40 years later. We've lapsed 40 years. What the Jewish traditional tales will tell you in the Mishnah and the Mikvah, they will tell you that Moses went south into Nubia and Cush, those kingdoms, and that he married a Cushite princess and eventually ended up in Midian and married a wife in Midian as well, many years later. So this is, these are how the stories are. So you're missing facts that are part of the religious tradition. Even the religious traditional tale is not all told in the book of Exodus, because there's more to it than that. So there are a lot of missing facts, I believe. And so when you start looking for historical fact, you start finding out more about these people. It would be like going to the Jesus story and looking up Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea. You only get a tidbit of what he was all about in the New Testament, but you can crack open and find a whole lot more about him historically than existed in the pages of Scripture.
Right.
So I think the same for Moses. I think he was a man who I believe was not by practice a Jehovah worshiper until he was 80 years old, and he had his personal spiritual epiphany at what he writes about as being the burning bush. And remember, he was the only one there, the only one who saw it, the only one who wrote about it. So we only take it on the word of Moses himself that faith story is true. But we can't establish that ever was true. Now, it's interesting. I got to tell you this. When John and I were hiking up the mountain Serebet El Chedim in the Sinai last year, and we did it again this last February on our tour out there with some people. But we did our research trip a year ago, and we were the guests of Sheikh Barakat out in the Sinai wilderness of the book of Exodus. And we climbed this mountain that we believe is the mountain of God, as mentioned in the Old Testament. And not the traditional site or one of the other candidates, but this is the place. Up at the top of this mountain is the 3,500-year-old ruins of the temple of Hathor, the calf goddess of Egypt. And there was mining that took place in all the mountains around it, and she was the patron god of the miners and of fertility and happiness and so on. And so we went up to this mountain And this is one of the places where John and I agree, is that this, no matter who our character was, this is the mountain of God that he visited. And when Moses led the people out of Israel, out of Egypt, and they came to the mountain of God, as the Bible talks about. Remember, he goes up in the mountain, he's up there for 40 days and 40 nights, fasting, and carving the tablets of the law, and so on. I happen to believe that he went to a place he had been before, and that the active priest caste that lived there at the top of Mount Serabet el-Khadim, that he visited with them, and he wrote the law, bits of the law, and he wrote down the tablets of the law, and so on. But remember the people down on the ground?
Uh-huh.
In the biblical story, they say, they come to Aaron, his brother, and they say, "Where is this man Moses? He's up in the mountain." In the vernacular of the Hebrew, they're actually saying, "Where's this guy? This Moses? He let us out. Now we don't even know where is he? He's up in the mountain. Build us a god that we can worship." And so they built the golden calf, a representation of the goddess whose mountain they are at in Egyptian culture. Serabet el-Khadim, the mountain of Hathor at the top, is her temple. And that's why they built it there. So I think there's lots of these little bits and pieces of evidence that you can string together.
Right. Now, we got 14 minutes left. I don't want you to run out of time. So why don't we move into John's theory?
Yes, and I'll treat it a little lighter than my own theory, even though I didn't even hit the tip of the surface of the iceberg with mine here. But John believes that Moses was a man named Amenhotep, son of Hapu. He was the Grand Vizier again, underneath the pharaoh of the same name, Amenhotep III. And Amenhotep, son of Hapu, was a Grand Vizier, and he really focuses it on the destruction of Lake Malkata, which is down in Luxor today, or ancient Thebes. Now, Lake Malkata, it's not a lake today, and there's villages built up all around its old walls. You can't even tell. If you didn't know it was there, you wouldn't know it was a lake. There's these big fertile fields, and on the other side, the western side of this area, is the Sahara Desert. And but if you look at an aerial map, you can see it. If you look to the south and the west of Luxor on the west bank, look for Malkata, you'll see this structure. It was 1.5 miles long by 1 mile wide, this man-made lake that was built by Amenhotep III. And this lake broke, the walls broke and flooded the western village of Thebes. And it created a great catastrophe. And John believes that he's identified all 10 of the plagues coming out of the destruction of that. And he bases it on that. And then he bases many things on Amenhotep, son of Hapu, the Grand Vizier, underneath Amenhotep III, who, by the way, is the father to Amenhotep IV, who we better know as Akhenaten. Neither John and I believe Akhenaten has anything to do with Moses. Akhenaten, it was a totally different situation there. A clash of religion, a clash with the priesthood, a clash within internal in Egypt, and it lasted a generation. And then his son, of course, as we all know, was the great King Tut, Tutankhamun. But Amenhotep III, John believes, is the pharaoh of the Exodus. This wall broke, created devastation in ancient Thebes, and it was Amenhotep, son of Hapu, the Grand Vizier, who led workers, people, Thebans out of the area and over to safety and into the Sinai. They migrated out, and John believes this is the archetype for the character of Moses. And so I can't go into much more detail about his theory without getting into just the minutiae of why he establishes this man is so. But he believes there are many different facts, the brother and the sister, the position in the temple, the different things that happen, all the different kinds of archaeological finds around Hapu, that he establishes this as his archetype for Moses. And this is a unique theory to John Ward. Nobody has ever put that theory out there before. And so there you have it. Within the 18th dynasty, John and I have our pharaohs. I believe Hatshepsut, as I mentioned, was the pharaoh who raised Senenmut to power. Senenmut was Moses. He came back after fleeing Egypt, and Amenhotep II was the young pharaoh on the throne during the time of the Exodus. And I believe Amenhotep II was my pharaoh of the Exodus. Amenhotep III was the pharaoh of the Exodus in John's theory, and there's 2 generations between them. And that's the basics of what we present in this book. And for anybody getting the book, it's not just dry fact. We really try to present it in a way that brings it down to very understandable language. We incorporate the academics, the necessary academics, to, in a sense, almost appease the academic crowd who would look at our book, while at the same time being very readable to people who aren't necessarily historians and aren't necessarily academics. And there's also the best part about the book, I think, is it's filled with our pictures from that tour. There's about 70, I think, or so black and white pictures, and then there's 16 pages of full color layouts of taking this trip and finding the real historical Moses. So it was a fun book to write. I think it's going to be a fun book to read for people. And I think it presents 2 very cogent theories out there. And we've had some pretty good praise of the book itself. So from academics and non-academics alike.
I thought it was a great book, and it covers a lot of information, and really and truly, even if both of you were to happen as to be wrong, not that you either one are, but one of you have to be, hey, it's chock full of useful information above and beyond that, in other words.
Yes. I think, and we try to do that because there's, even in just simply trying to establish, were the Israelites present in Egypt? I think we've established, aside from the story of Moses, there's a plausible picture there that says, yes, we believe that they were. And this is how you can establish that, based on secondhand information and setting a plausible stage for the story. So there's lots of good information in there.
Now, also, I found an article online that got my interest with John talking about Amenhotep, because I believe there was more than one Amenhotep, so I don't know if this is the same one or not.
There are a bunch of, yeah.
This article does not specify son of Hatshepsut. However, he would have been around Joseph's time, and these people are speculating that this Amenhotep was perhaps Joseph, because they were both second in command under the Pharaoh. They both lived to be 110 years of age. They were both great architects and builders. They stored up corn during 7 years of plenty, saw 7 years of famine, and fed the people. They were interpreters of dreams. They built pyramids and palaces. I didn't know Joseph, unless, of course, he's talking about the Israelites as a general, built the pyramids or the palaces. Zephaniah over physicians was Joseph. Then the Amenhotep was a physician. It says here that Joseph instituted income tax 1/5, and so did Amenhotep. Married to the priesthood of On, both of them actually. Knowledge of astrology for both of them. I'm not so sure we could credit Joseph with that one or not. You'd probably know more than I would.
Well, I see a lot of theories that people put out there on who Moses was, who Joseph was. I think you've got to look at some of the basic facts. Now, if Joseph was raised to power under a Hyksos king, he wouldn't have borne the name of Amenhotep. That would be my first reaction to that. According to the biblical account, and there's no record of this name anywhere in Egyptian history other than little bits and pieces that you try to piece together, but you can't really come up with the actual person. The Bible said that he was called Zaphnath-Paneah, and in Egyptian, and there are no direct correlations for Zaphnath-Paneah in Egyptian records, and so there's there's little bits and pieces, but they don't match up to who the character could have been. When you look at that, Amenhotep, I think it's a family name, it's a dynastic name. Which I believe happened long before the historical record gives it the ability to be used. So it's like the whole issue of Ramses II. If you watch the old Charlton Heston Yule-Brynner movie, the Ten Commandments, it was Ramses and Moses. If you watch very well done, by the way, the DreamWorks animated film, The Prince of Egypt, they have Ramses II as being the pharaoh. That was a theory for the longest time, was Ramses. And the only reason that Ramses became the prime candidate, a couple of 150 years ago, really, when they started establishing some of this, was that the biblical story says that the Hebrews, while they were slaves in Egypt, built the treasure cities of Pithom and Ramses, or together they were known as Pi-Ramses. And who built those cities? Ramses II. During the 1250s, it was when he started his reign, BC, about 200 years later than either John's or my theory in the 1400s. Now, the problem with that is that there's no evidence whatsoever that there were any slave people like the Hebrews that lived, that an Exodus took place, a Moses character, so on. They're just void of any evidence. The only evidence they go on is that the treasure cities of Pithom and Ramses were built by the Hebrews. Now, the problem with that, and this is one of the things John and I bring out in the book, some of the information, historically, 1,000 years after the events of the Exodus, the nation of Israel had been established. They'd already gone through wars and battles. They'd been carried away into captivity by the Babylonians. The Babylonians released them after a couple hundred years, all but go back to their homeland. There were 72 rabbis who in the 400s BC went to the Library of Alexandria in Egypt and pled their case to Arsinoe, the queen of Egypt, and got the permission of Ptolemy II, the Greco-Roman pharaoh of Egypt, to go to the Library of Alexandria and recompile the Old Testament Hebrew scriptures. And so what they did was they had these 72 rabbis all in different cells, all recompiling the oral traditions and what remnants they had of written tradition, of written documents, and they came up with the Old Testament in Greek, the Septuagint, which is what our Old Testament is written off of, the Greek Septuagint. And that document, however, that's where you get some of these facts that are mixed up. What the rabbis were doing, a very noble goal, they were trying to do two things. One, reestablish the history for the nation of Israel, and two, bolster the faithful Jews of Israel. And so this is why they recompiled these documents.
But
now,
they were incomplete.
They were incomplete. This is why I think you have holes in the Exodus story, why you don't have the pharaohs named. This is why I believe they called the treasure cities of Pithom and Ramses. That is what the name of those cities were at the time when this document, the Septuagint, was written in the 400s BC. But Pithom and Ramses, or Pi-Ramses, stood on a much older city called Avaris. And Avaris is the city that would have existed during the time of the Hebrew dwelling in the land of Goshen. And you can go to Pi-Ramses today, and beneath Pi-Ramses, the rebuilt city of Ramses II rebuilt the city of Avaris as his treasure city. And Avaris has vast ruins of quarters for really common folk. There's some Semitic overtones to some of the structures there. Not a lot. But so it'd be like saying, who built the city of New York? Well, the Dutch. Well, no, they didn't. They built New Amsterdam. We renamed it New York much later. It's the same thing with Avaris and Pi-Ramses. And this is why Ramses was tagged as the pharaoh of the Exodus, because he built the treasure cities that the Hebrews built. Well, they didn't build his city. He rebuilt the city they built several hundred years earlier, Avaris. And that's where I think this is where some of this historical information becomes important in placing when Moses lived and when things happened.
All righty. Well, I see the hour has slipped up upon us. Is there anything you wanted to mention that we didn't get a chance to cover real quick?
Well, can I give you a plug?
Sure.
I got a couple of plugs here. John and I take a trip to Egypt. We took a trip back in February and March. We brought 10 people along. The Exodus Reality Adventures. You can just go to our website, exodusreality.com. We have 10 open slots for our October tour, the 13th through the 27th. Go check it out. And if you have any questions, my phone number is there. You can call me directly. Also, happening in October, the first weekend in October, is our big event. I publish Intrepid magazine, and you can find that at intrepidmag.com. But also, we put on the Paradigm Symposium every year. And this year, it's the 2nd through the 5th of October. And we have guests such as Graham Hancock, Eric von Daniken, We have Andrew Collins, Robert Bivall. We have Barry Fitzgerald, Marie D. Jones, Larry Flexman, Laird Scranton, Dr. John Ward, myself, Micah Hanks, a lot of people that your listeners are familiar with. And that's taking place, and tickets are on sale now at ParadigmSymposium.com.
I have been trying for over 3 years to establish contact with Graham Hancock, but there is not much.
He will be at our event.
I won't be able to make it.
Oh.
I don't suppose you could help me get a hookup with him, though, could you?
Sure, I could give you an introduction.
I would appreciate that, because he doesn't have hardly any contact info online, in other words.
He's on Facebook.
Well, yeah, he's on Facebook, but otherwise I left messages today, and I assumed that maybe somebody was doing the page for him, in other words, because he didn't get back.
Yeah, he does. That is his page, but I'm sure he's got some people that help him out with that. I also, one of our big sponsors for Paradigm Symposium is Inner Traditions Publishing, and they publish his books. I'm sorry, Red Wheel Wiser. We have Inner Traditions is one of our sponsors, but also Red Wheel Wiser, Hampton Roads Books publishes Graham Hancock, and they're the ones that really got us in touch with him. So,
that's how I go about it.
Yeah.
I'd say I'm hooked up with Inner Tradition. I get so many guests.
Oh, this would be Red Wheel Wiser. Red Wheel Wiser Books.
Red Wheel Wiser, got you. All righty. Well, with that, I want to thank everybody for listening. Couldn't have a show without my listeners anymore. I could have one without a guest. And if you did nothing but listen, you did participate, and I do appreciate it. Don't forget to invite your friends, and don't forget to go to www.intrepidmag.com. And he should have a link there to the Paradigm Symposium. Is that not correct?
It's right on the top menu at intrepidmag.com. You'll see Paradigm Symposium as one of the links.
And then you could also go to www.exodusreality.com to learn more about the book. And is that the same place to go to book a tour to Egypt?
You can find the link on there. There is a link over there, somewhere in there on the Intrepid Mag page. But you can just go to Exodus Reality. Don't go to Exodus Realty. That's a site out there, and you'll end up buying a house somewhere in Florida. But exodusreality.com, and you can see all about the trip in the book.
Alrighty. Sure they're going to buy a house in Egypt now.
You might. And by the way, I'll just say, I know in the closing seconds here, people have a concern about the unrest in Egypt. It is one of the most welcoming, warmest places. The people there are welcoming. If you don't want trouble, you don't go where the trouble is, and that's in very isolated pockets. 98% of the country is not in unrest. The country itself is seeking identity, but it's safe. We were there with 10 people. I had my own 2 daughters over there with me. I'm not going to bring my daughters into a hotbed. We had a wonderful, peaceful, welcoming, warm time. There was one spot where we were surrounded by 10,000 Egyptian people, all crowded down on this beach at the monument of Abu Simbel of Ramses II to watch the sunrise on his birthday. Everybody partying and festivals and dancing, happy, greeting us. It's a wonderful place to visit.
Sounds like it's a wonderful place to visit. Matter of fact, I know some other people that do tours of Egypt, Stephen Myler being one of them.
Yes. There are many groups. Robert Bivall was just over there with a group and just came back. He called me the other morning. He's been back for a week or so. And he was just over there with a tour. And Zai Hawass leads tours, and we bumped into his tour group over there. And so there are, to say it this way, put it concisely, I believe the Western press has exploited the people of Egypt by sensationalizing the news. And it has done nothing but hurt Egypt. And the people are craving Americans to come over and visit, and it's a wonderful place to go.
All righty, well, I'm sure that'll be helpful to some people. And with that, we're going to call this one here a wrap. Scott, it's been a pleasure having you again, and I look forward to having you. I'm pretty sure you're going to write another book in the future, right?
We're working on a book called The Lost Armies of Cambyses.
That's right, I read that.
And that's, in a nutshell, the Persian king in 525 BC. Cambyses invaded Egypt, sacked it, went out, took his army on a forced march into the western deserts to destroy the oracle at Siwa, and they were engulfed by a sandstorm and never seen again. And
wow.
That's the historical mystery.
So you're going to try to solve the mystery?
I think it's solved already, and it's just not widely publicized. And John's been out in the Western Desert many times, and so we're taking a little expedition in May out there to finalize this stuff on our book. So it'll be an interesting book coming up probably next year early.
All right. Well, I'll be looking forward to it.
Fantastic.
You have a good one.
You too, Royce. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye-bye.